Hello, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to episode 20 of my Pro Tools 11 video tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to continue looking at elastic audio, and we're going to specifically take a look at the rhythmic mode and using rhythmic mode to quantize live drums. Now, the rhythmic mode can be used for really anything that's percussive. It works well with drum loops. It works well even with really percussive sounding guitar. And the difference between rhythmic and polyphonic and monophonic is that rhythmic preserves the transient material better. So whereas polyphonic and monophonic will sort of stretch or compress a note equally, rhythmic will preserve the transient, like the hit of the drum, and then stretch out the tail in order to set the drums in time while producing still hard-hitting drums that don't have their transient blurred or their attack blurred. So what I've got here is some live drums. It's pretty typical. I've got a kick-in mic, snare top, bottom, even a snare side mic, two toms, hi-hat mic, an accent mic on the ride cymbal. We put a condenser mic in the ISO booth and left the door open just to get the tone of the ISO room. A stereo pair of overheads and a stereo pair of ribbon mics in the room just to pick up the room a bit. And we ended up with a pretty decent sound. So let me play a little bit of that for you. That's no mixing involved other than me just, setting the levels. There's no plugins or anything like that, no processing on that at all. So one of the things I like to do with drums is I always like to cut the drums and other instruments on two separate days because I like to do the drums and then use elastic audio to set the drums to the grid to make sure that they're perfectly in time. And the same thing sort of goes like what I said in the previous episode, where depending on the style of music or the genre of music, you may or may not want the drums to be perfectly set to the grid. You may want them to have a little bit of ebb and flow. For this is sort of like a pop country song, pop rock, bluesy country song. I want everything to be perfectly to the grid. So before I bring in my other musicians, before I bring in the bass player and the guitar player and the singer and all that, I want to have the drums set to time so that everyone's playing to the drummer. It's going to end up with a better result that way. Because if the drummer's a little bit off, everyone's going to be a little bit off. So to do this, we can't just individually quantize each track like we did with monophonic and polyphonic. We actually have to put all of these in a group and then edit them as a group. So what I'm going to do is just click on the top track, hold Shift, click on the bottom, hit Command G or Control G in a PC. I'm going to create a new group. I'm going to call this the drum group. I'll just call it drums. There we go. Hit OK. Make sure the group is on over here. And not only will editing functions with your regular edit tools work on all of these now, elastic audio will work on all of them now, so it's really cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the little oil can icon here, choose rhythmic this time. This may take a second because it's going to have to individually analyze each one of these. You can see they're starting to pop back to blue now, but when they're in gray like this, they're being analyzed for transients. And this process is not going to be nearly as easy as the previous video was, because there's going to be a lot of notes that we're going to have to go in and intentionally ignore certain transients just because we don't want, say, an individual hi-hat note to be locked to the grid. We want the hard transients locked to the grid. So basically your kick, your snare, your toms. So there's two schools of thought here. One school of thought is use the kick and the snare tracks as a reference, like your kick in and your snare top track as a reference for what you're going to set to the grid, or you can use like the overhead track. I'm going to try both. I'm going to pull the overhead track up here just so I can see everything, because it's these hard notes are the ones I want to be right on the grid. Stuff in between here doesn't necessarily have to be perfectly on the grid, because if I try to set it on the grid, it's actually going to, degrade the quality of the audio. So we want this to sound as perfect as possible without any digital artifacts. So first things first, let's change our grid to an eighth note, just so we can have a smaller eighth note set, or a smaller grid setting. As you can see, he is a bit off the grid at points. Not too bad. He sounds pretty good, but you can see he falls pretty far off the grid in some other spots. There's one particular spot where he played like a little snare, just a quick little snare. It wasn't even really a fill, but it was just a set of eighth notes. Yeah, like right there. Things like that we may have to come in and manually quantize, because there are some spots where after we quantize this, it may not be perfect. There are some spots where the note might have quantized to the wrong direction or to the wrong note, and we'll have to go back and manually edit them. So here's generally the way I work. I'm going to go to Analysis View, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this, and I'm going to look at the overheads, and I'm going to look at the other tracks, particularly the overheads, the kick in, and the snare. And I'm going to look for any notes, like any analysis markers like this, that don't need to be there. And I'm going to delete them. Because in the end, it's going to actually cause us more problems than it solves trying to quantize those notes. So I'm just going to go through this whole thing. And I'm just going to look for those, like here. And there may be there may be notes in there that are being played, but they're just not they're not important enough to be locked to the grid. Like something like this. This is like a hi-hat note. That's fine. That's not really too big of a deal. It's the ones like this where you see like multiple repetitions in a row. And some of these I can tell are probably like ghost notes on the snare drum, where he's like sort of hit the snare hard and then he sort of rattled against it softly. Those don't need to be quantized. That's just going to degrade the audio. So we're going to do a little bit of work now to save us a lot of work later. And I should just mention while I'm doing this, this is a pretty standard practice now in pop music and rock music. Back in the day, you just had to keep playing the take until you got it perfectly right. And even then, I can think of hundreds and hundreds of recordings from the 80s and the 70s where, the drums weren't perfectly in time. And that's fine, If you're going for a looser feel, like with the reggae example I showed in the last video, that very well may end up sounding better in the long run than trying to do this. Because sometimes if you over-quantize, the drums can sort of lose their groove. There's like a feel to it. And sometimes when you like over-quantize, it starts to sound like MIDI drums or programmed drums rather than a real drummer. So there are some ways we can sort of combat that, where we can intentionally quantize but not quantize 100%. If we have a moment, I may show you that in this video. If not, I'll go over it and once we get over more deep into MIDI later on. So I'm just going through, and anything that's not really on a hard transient or like a noticeable transient, especially again, these little ghost notes are gonna kill me. There we go. We're gonna lock all this in time. All right, how far are we? All right, so we're not even halfway through. So just for the sake of this video, I'm just gonna stop there. Where did I stop at? Measure 20-ish? Okay. So yeah, you'd want to take a few minutes, go through the whole thing, and do what I'm just did there, deleting any of the notes that don't need to be quantized. So now that I've gotten rid of my unnecessary analysis markers, I can go to Warp View, and when I quantize this, I'm going to get a better result in my quantization. So looking at the grid, because I was on an eighth note, it looks like we generally have notes that are mostly on eighth notes. Now there's a few spots where there's some sixteenths in here too. Those we're going to come back and manually quantize. I always like to quantize to a larger value than I actually need, because especially with drums, if you again get in the habit of quantizing every single little 16th note that's out there, you're just going to lose the feel and you're going to lose the groove of the drums. So I'm just going to go to option 0. By the way, if you want to do this manually, you can go to event operations, quantize, or just hit option 0. I'm going to quantize to an 8th note, and I'm going to hit apply. And you can see everything snaps to the grid. So let's give this a listen and see what it sounds like. Now I hear like how there's some hesitation after those ghost notes now. It's because of this marker right here. So you may find yourself going through. You may find yourself going through and deleting some markers that are actually causing the music to sound a bit behind in this case. Actually, no, it sounds like the ghost note's actually rushing. And it's all because of this little marker right here. So I'm just looking at the snare track and looking for these ghost notes. And I'm just going through, and every single time I see a ghost note, I'm deleting the marker that's in front of it. So this is, I probably should have, when we were in analysis view before, I probably should have seen that and decided to just take it out. So like I said, this takes quite a bit of work, but the end result is totally worth it to have a drum track that is metronomically in time, that the guitarist can play to, the bass player can play to, and have basically perfect timing. What I am going to do with these tom fills, though, is I'm going to manually set them to 16th notes. So let me just set the grid to a 16th note. Use my grabber tool, grab these, and lock those right in place. There we go. So let's have a listen. And there was that fill that we had before. I can actually take that second note and pull it in if I want to. And again, just so you can hear the before and after, here's the after. If we remove all of our warp markers by right-clicking and pressing remove warp marker, this is the before. So it sounds sort of disjunct, and here's the after. So we can fix little things like that. Now, some people swear with drums just to basically quantize the downbeats. You can certainly do that. Again, you have to ask yourself, what sort of feel do you want this to have? Do you want it to be a little bit more loose, or does it need to be really tight? This being sort of like a pop rock country song, I want it to be perfectly in time. It's just, I want it to be super uber radio friendly. If this is like a jazz tune, or like some, like an alternative rock tune, or something that's just a little more loose, like reggae, you may choose to do no flex or no elastic audio, or less elastic audio, maybe just quantizing the downbeats, like the whole notes, and that's it. Now, just like I did in the previous episode, generally when I'm all done and I'm happy with the result, I'll generally will go back to waveform view, right click, and then, or not right click, excuse me, I'll do Shift Option 3 to consolidate. One thing I didn't show you in the previous episode is if you turn off elastic audio while you're using it, while one of your clips has the little oil can icon on it, if you say none, it'll ask you, do you want to commit your edits, or do you want to revert to the original? If you say revert, it's going to take out all those edits we just made and go back to the original file. If you say commit, it's going to re-render all of these files into a new clip. It's going to take a moment. There we go. And then now all of those edits we made are rendered into the file. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.